All right, tonight's presentation is the Shrewsbury Charitable Society by Tom Kelleher. Something about the presentation. Early Americans sought to improve their society with the world by organizing into voluntary associations to address particular problems. Shrewsbury, Mass. Was no different. In 1832, several women of Shrewsbury formed a charitable society, binding together to socialize and for the less fortunate neighbors. Based on the work of the late Jack Larkin, longtime chief historian at Old Sturbridge Village. Our presenter is Tom Kelleher. He's currently a historian and curator of the mechanical arts at Old Sturbridge Village in Sturbridge, Mass. He regularly teaches and demonstrates at museums and historical societies around the country. Tom holds a master's degree in history from the University of Connecticut and writes often for a variety of magazines.
Thanks for having me. As Eric said, this is not my work, but my late colleague Jack Larkin presented this at the New England Historical Society back in 1980. But the paper is still available online at the Old Sturbridge Village website. I realize you're not online, so you can't just click on the link there. But anybody's watching it can write down the link or just go to our website and try to navigate through the various ways to explore and learn, and eventually you'll find it. You can search for Shrewsbury in the search engine and it should come up. But anyway, so if you want to read the paper yourself, I'm not going to read the paper to you. I'm going to read sections of it, make some of my own observations, and summarize a lot of it. So, anyhow, during the summer of 1832, Mrs. Elizabeth Ward of Shrewsbury, there she is, right there, had been actively urging the formation of a new organization here in town. She was 72 in 1832, and 7 of her 10 children had grown and were still alive, and she was the wife of the town's wealthiest and most eminent citizen, Thomas Walter Ward Sr., who had just retired as the Worcester County Sheriff. The full weight of her prestige and influence can only be inferred from the fact that on August 23rd, 1832, quote, in compliance with the requests of Mrs. Elizabeth Ward, a very respectable number of ladies convened at Central Hall. That's where we are right now, at Central Hall. In the town of Shrewsbury. They were upstairs, not down here where we are. They were upstairs. In the town of Shrewsbury for the purpose of forming themselves into a benevolent society for aiding and assisting the sick and destitute in said town, and agreed to be known by the name of the Shrewsbury Charitable Society. And there's an earlier picture of the building we're in, a stage reinterpretation of a charitable society meeting that we did at Old Sturbridge Village, and a map of the town. These are the words I just read from their incorporation from their Constitution. Americans in the early Republic were known for getting together and forming organizations. A British, I think it's British, a European, I'll call him, observer. I can never remember exactly who said it. I can't remember if it was de Tocqueville, if it was Charles Dickens. Google searches don't identify either one of them, but some European once said, you get three, in the early 1800s, you get 3 Americans in a room, they'll write a constitution, elect one president, another vice president, and the third secretary treasurer. And there were over a dozen different organizations formed here in Shrewsbury in the early 1800s that followed this same model of getting together, writing a constitution, electing officers, and keeping minutes. There's their constitution. I'm not going to read it anymore, but you can see it's just modeled on the federal constitution. Article 1, Article 2, Article 3, and so forth. There'll be a meeting of the society on Thursday of every second week from the blah, 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 from 2 to 5 o'clock p.m., then annual meetings to be held the third Thursday in May, and so forth and so on. Here's the officers of the society, and more articles, and then they signed it. Actually, the signing went on for 2 more pages after this. So, considerable number of ladies eventually joined over the 11 years from 1832 to 1842 that this record book that survives contains. So in the early 1800s, the very late 1700s, a lot of change was going on throughout America, throughout New England, and including here in Shrewsbury. Back in the 1790s, you going along the main road here, you wouldn't see very much going on. Most people lived on scattered farmsteads. You'd see the church, you might see a house or two near it, the minister's home, and not much else until you got to another scattered farm. Once you get away from the center village here, am I pushing the right button? There we go. Once you get away from the center village here, you can see people are living on scattered farmsteads across the countryside. If I had a bigger map of the town, if you look at the bigger maps of the town, this map is actually, the original is just to the left of the screen. You can go up afterwards and look at it. You can see most people are just living on scattered farmsteads. And that's the way it had been even in the center of the community. Most towns you'd have a grassy to a dusty area that had been kept as town property as a common, a place for the militia to practice, the church on town land, a burying ground on town land, and that was about it for the center of these little communities, including Shrewsbury. But in the late early 1800s, you find more and more building up, more expansion of business, and you see these nucleated center villages occurring with tradesmen, professionals, doctors, lawyers, ministers, craftsmen, especially shoemakers, blacksmiths, and so forth, congregating around the geographic center near where the meeting house and the burying ground and the common happened to be. Elizabeth Ward's son, Andrew, in 1823, described the occupants around the center of town. He said, among the tenants of the 50 houses here in the center are 2 clergymen, an attorney, two physicians, 4 merchants, 1 watchmaker, 3 gunsmiths, 3 blacksmiths, 2 tailors, 1 shoemaker, 1 tanner, 1 cabinet maker, 2 chaise makers, 2-wheeled carriages, 3 house carpenters, 1 tavern keeper, etc. End of the quotation. By 1830, by the way, the watchmaker had moved to Worcester, and the one shoemaker that Andrew Ward mentioned in 1823 had grown to a dozen shoemakers living along the main road. Now, this whole change that's going on across America is a fascinating story that is more than I can get into tonight. If you really want to learn more about it, Jack Larkin himself wrote a book on it, The Reshaping of Everyday Life, which got translated into like 23 languages. You can probably find used copies on the internet for fairly cheap. Another good book, if you want to read more than the one book on it, this is another excellent one. Mary Babson-Furer's book, A Crisis of Community. The New England town she talks about, the trials and transformations of a New England town, 1815 to 1848, is Boylston, not far from here. She worked with another document in our research library, the diary of a woman in Boylston, Mary White, and the various papers of the White family that survive. And Mary Fuhrer does a wonderful job of taking these large national trends and illustrating with specific instances in the lives of specific local people, but explaining the large national trend. So it's very good for that. If you want to get a worldwide view, Paul Johnson's The Birth of the Modern is another good one. It says the world. It's mostly the Western world, Europe and America, but still, it's a much broader view than the very community-focused view of Mary or Jack's United States view. Another good book, not to, I don't have any interest in these books. I've read them. I can recommend them. If you're going to read a third book, I would say you're probably not going to read one, but if you're going to read a third, I recommend Waking Giant. It's an easy read. It's not very long. It's very engaging. And again, it takes a national view about the changes that America was undergoing in the early 19th century. There's there's at least a dozen books that are very well written, very scholarly, that basically talk about this period in the late 1700s, early 1800s in American history, but they take different focuses. They tell the same story, but from a different focus. I included two of them. Charles Sellers talks about how the commercial landscape was dramatically changing in this period in the market revolution, and Daniel Walker Howe basically says that basically communication was the big innovation that caused all this change in the What Hath God Wrought, which of course is the first phrase broadcast on the telegraph by Samuel F.B. Morris. Anyhow, what's driving all this in one way or another is commerce and manufacturing. This is driving the transportation revolution, the manufacturing revolution. And manufacturing is not just the big textile factories that are all across New England's landscape in small towns and large towns like Lowell, but it's going on right here on downtown Shrewsbury in those shoemaker shops. A lot of shoemakers are doing custom work, but more and more are doing what they call bottoming. Women were being paid to sew uppers in their home for a couple cents a piece, to sew the upper pieces together that had been given to them already pre-cut out, and then a middleman would pick those up and distribute them to men in little shops who would put on the soles and heels and just crank them out. None of these people had extensive training or expensive tools to do this. It was things you could pick up fairly quickly and cheaply, but you could earn cash wages, which with cash meant much more fluid economy, that you could have much more buying and selling, which encouraged the merchants and the storekeepers who were bringing in things. Back in colonial America, you would often have one or two people in town that were usually referred to as traders, that when they went to urban centers would pick up a few basic commodities in bulk and then sell them as needed to their neighbors at a profit. But they didn't have extensive establishments for this. But by the early 1800s, you have more and more country stores, and that adjective is what they called them. After the Civil War, people around here start calling them general stores. But before the Civil War, here in New England, they called them country stores because that was the more effective adjective. They were in the country. They weren't in urban centers, in port cities, where stores had been in colonial America. And so these stores are selling all sorts of things, textiles especially. More than anything else, these country stores sold machine-made textiles, sewing notions, ribbons, thread, needles, pins, buttons, all sorts of things like that, but also sold salt fish and paint pigments and manufactured tools, so you didn't have to go to your neighborhood blacksmith and he would forge out a fairly clunky hoe. You could get a much higher quality, lighter, more long-lasting hoe or shovel or scythe or anything else that were being mass-produced, oftentimes in small country towns where they dammed up a river and set up a manufactory. But these distribution networks were causing all this growth and concentration around trade routes in the centers of these country towns, and changed how people were living their lives. And of course, all that includes moving around. There were over 100 stage lines that crisscrossed New England by the 1830s, including going down Main Street here. They called them stagecoaches because they, of course, staged fresh horses every 10 or 15 miles along the route so that you could go much faster than working the same animals all day long. But increasingly, the need for speed was felt, and people were moving around a whole lot more. In 1823, I believe, a correspondent to a Boston newspaper used the phrase, "Seems like the whole country is in motion." But another change in this, with all this growth, was that their own lives were changing. First off, rural New England was becoming less homogeneous. There was a growing gap between the haves and the have-nots. The rich were getting richer. The poor might not be getting poorer, but there was a bigger gap between the most prosperous people in a community and the least prosperous that has continued to grow right down to today. I don't have to tell you that, but it was noticeable by the early 1800s, different than it had been in the 1700s. And you had a lot more people engaged in trade and in commerce and other less traditional ways of making a living than just agriculture. Um, One of the changing values that was going on and expectations was people were marrying later and having intentionally smaller families. I mean, in the birth rate went down by 2 children per couple between the late 1700s and the early 1800s. Now, by our standards, going from an average of 7 children per couple to 5 children per couple still sounds like awfully big families. But for them, it was a dramatic decrease in the number of children that families were having, and it was intentional by marrying later, by using other means, limiting family size, because children on a farm are often an economic asset as well as an economic burden. But for merchants, for tradesmen, increasingly children, for professionals, children are more of an economic burden than an economic asset. You love your children and everything else, but still in all, you could definitely see this diminution of fertility. Another thing that was changing is in the 16 and 1700s, most of these country towns had one church. The Congregational Church, what originally the Puritans called the Church of Christ in New England, had evolved into being called the Congregational Church because, of course, each congregation was an independent entity. No bishop, no pope, no church synod telling them what to do. The ministers got together and talked, sure, but each congregation was independent. But most communities, that's where people gathered in communities in the 1700s. When they're living on scattered farmsteads, they're getting together once a week for worship at the center meeting house, and then getting together a couple times a year. The men get together for town meeting, usually in the center meeting house. But by the 1800s, you often have a number of different denominations, and most towns end up having a few. It varies from town to town, but a lot of towns have a New England Baptist society, increasingly Universalists, sometimes Methodists. Later on, the influence of Unitarians creeps out from the greater Boston area into rural areas, and you have other church sects, and so people are gathering in more separate groups. Increasingly, a fragmented society like we increasingly get today with the internet. I don't have to tell you. I mean, at one time, we can remember when most of us got our news from the same basic sources. But now, most people tend to get their news from, well, most people under 50 get their news from comedy programs and stuff on the internet. But, no offense to anybody under 50 in the room, but that's true. It's not something I'm making up wryly. That's a fact. But increasingly, people leaning left look towards left-leaning news sources, and people leaning politically right look to right-leaning news sources. And in my opinion, that's why we have a more fragmented society, is because you have less of a center and less of a common source of information. We get told what we want to hear increasingly. But off my soapbox. But that's, I think, important growing in the 19th century, because you don't have that homogenized society. It's much more different people gathering in different groups than getting together as a community. And religion was one thing. And what really grows up, and what this talk is about, because I've departed considerably from Jack's original paper here, quite obviously, because I've been looking at the screen, not down, is voluntary associations. And he gets into that. But the voluntary associations are that idea of people who get together consciously with people of common interests, some common interests. Now, they're not exclusive. A lot of times you might be involved in a number of different voluntary associations, a number of different groups. You probably are only really involved in one church. So occasionally you might go to a different one, but you tend to at one time only be involved in one church. usually in one political party at a time. But a number of other groups, and these are modern descriptions of voluntary associations, but I think that puts it in our language better. But you have a number of these different groups, and you might be a member of several of them. But each one, you're gathering with a much more discrete group of people, not everybody. So you have a more fragmented, cliquish, if you will, society. Alexis de Tocqueville, who you may or may not know, was a French lawyer who in 1830, with his friend and fellow lawyer Gustave de Beaumont, was sent on a mission from France to come study American prisons. And they spent 11 months touring the United States from the north to the south to the east to the west. They traveled all over in 11 months. And they went back to France, and they wrote the report that they were paid to come here and write about our prison reforms. But de Tocqueville wrote a book that's still in print today. It's never been out of print. That even within a year of when he wrote it was translated into English, Democracy in America. Which has not gone out of print since he wrote it in 1835. Actually, it came out in 2 volumes, one in 1835, one in 1840. But the point is, you still see in political science classes today, almost everybody at least reads an abridged version of Alexis de Tocqueville. Politicians will still often quote passages, sometimes without citing him, sections of Democracy in America. De Beaumont, by the way, excuse me, wrote a book, a novel that exposed the issues of American slavery, and that book's much less popular, but you can still buy it in print or online. Anyway, the point is, Democracy in America, de Tocqueville really makes a point of voluntary associations being a very unique part of American society. And remember, he's writing for his fellow Frenchmen to understand democracy rather than for Americans in the 21st century to understand anything. But he observed that America was full of these voluntary associations. It was one thing that really struck him, how eager these Americans are getting together and forming clubs, if you will, forming these groups to get something done. And de Tocqueville observed, he said, in America, if you have a problem, and there's 100 people in your neighborhood, 100 people get together, they form an association to fix the problem. They write a constitution, they elect officers, they specify when you're going to meet and what you're going to do to fix the problem. He said, here in France, you get the same 100 people, each one of them goes home, writes an angry letter to the government saying, you have a problem you need to fix. My observation is Americans have become much more French in the past 150 years, but that's another matter. But that's why I bring up de Tocqueville. Just for allow me to take in a breath. These are more associations here in town. This is the Shrewsbury Mutual Improvement Society. Their constitution, you can see how much it resembles the ladies who gets together, a preamble, and then they go on with the whole constitution with Article 1, Article 2, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Other groups were formed in this and other towns, including the Thief Detecting Society. I hear you had a lecture a few months ago on the Thief Detecting Society. I was telling Chris, I live in Warren, Massachusetts. The Warren, about the same time in the early 1800s, also formed a Theft Detecting Society. It's still in business in Warren. We still have a Thief Detecting Society in Warren. In almost 200 years now, we haven't detected a single thief. But the point is then and now, these are social clubs. They're an excuse for people to get together with like-minded neighbors and spend time together. I think that initially, at least, they really thought they were there for a good purpose. People with property to protect their property in the case of the thief detecting societies. Fire departments. A lot of towns increasingly would buy equipment and organize volunteer fire brigades. And the gentlemen often, as you can see, with their own money, buy uniforms and train and take great pride in their position in the fire department as engine man or as fire ward or some other position, and get together periodically to meet, to train, to practice, and of course, in a time of emergency, go out and protect everyone's lives and property. Another one was the militia. The United States Constitution, the Second Amendment, of course, recalls our well-regulated militia, and Congress in 1793 wrote an act explaining that everybody's got to organize a voluntary militia. Well, they also allowed for, besides people having to serve a mandatory militia, a voluntary militia. If you wanted to, you could get together with your friends and organize a specialized militia company. And with your own money, you could buy your own equipment and your own uniforms, and you could all get together. And while you're also getting around and showing off your uniforms and how well you march and hoping the ladies will be attracted to you for your martial prowess, they can also, because they're getting together, and they do organize dances and picnics and other social activities. And these are just a few of the various things. The Shrewsbury Lyceum Society. You also had Oddfellow Society. These are Shrewsbury societies, by the way, and many more. Street improvement, debating, the Floral Society. Again, writing these constitutions. Lyceum was basically a group of usually men that get together for basically self-education. They'll take turns assigning each other to give a lecture, and they'll get together and listen to a lecture once a month or something like that. Well, anyway, we'll get back to the ladies and the Charitable Society. They don't seem to have gotten together as Lyceum societies. Where was I going? Let me get out. Okay, let's see. Between 1812 and 1840, here in Shrewsbury, you founded 12, not you, but your ancestors founded 12 voluntary associations, and there may have been others that the records haven't survived that we don't even know about. So these new patterns of affiliation were imposed on and partially replacing the earlier ones, like the church, like the annual town meeting. But they're also injecting a lot more vigor and life into society and into social life. And they're certainly increasingly part of social activities and social processes. But they're also directing people's loyalties and driven by people's individual interests. And oftentimes they're expanding people's thoughts beyond the local horizon. But that in itself starts diminishing the significance of the small community that, colonial and early federal New England towns were, where most people were farmers and farm families living on scattered plots, as people increasingly had diverse jobs and we're getting that. And most socialization, like the Lyceum Society, like the Ladies Charitable Society, like the fire departments, like the militia units, were very divided by gender. Society at the time, a lot of activities were very what's called homosocial. In other words, men socialized with the guys, the women socialized with the women. You would have some excuses to have women and men get together, like the militia might host, a dance for George Washington's birthday or something like that. But very often the month-to-month, week-to-week socialization was very much gender specific with these societies. But to take the Charitable Society, the Shrewsbury Ladies Charitable Society, as one specific, it's as an example of that long-term process of New England social transformation and how communities functioned in the 1830s. Why did they form? It doesn't seem that abject poverty or dramatic increase in poverty was a cause of the forming of the Charitable Society. You did have this sort of growing gap between wealth and poverty in the early 1800s as the overall economy became much stronger. Like I said, and the distribution of wealth in 1830 was much more unequal than it had been 40 years before. The well-to-do held proportionally much more property then the landless and the number of landless people had risen in the town. More and more householders every year were artisans, not yeoman farmers. And increasingly, those who were not farming, were not producing food, they're much more vulnerable to economic disaster. One thing I've read that during the 1930s, the Great Depression, is that so many people were able to have friends, relatives, etc., or roots, and could get back to food production in a way that 21st century America, if we had the same kind of economic downturn, we'd be in much worse shape than we were in our ancestors were in the 1930s. But one thing seems to have driven this idea of charity was not so the growing abject poverty, but rather the unequal wealth that society was experiencing and was becoming more obvious. Also, as the economy was improving, standards of living were improving, and you had rising expectations. In other words, what was considered enough in the 1790s was no longer considered enough in the 1830s. Think of it in our terms. I mean, today you can't live in a place that doesn't have central heating. Anybody want to take a guess when central heating became the norm for more than half the houses in America?
20s?
1950. It wasn't until 1950 that half the houses in America had central heat. That means half the houses still didn't have central heat in 1950. But now you got to have heat, you got to have hot and cold running water, sanitary sewerage, electric service, access to a telephone landline if anybody wants one anymore. Increasingly, we expect to have cable access and internet access, and increasing more and more and more and more. I mean, who would think of having a kitchen today without a microwave, or a home without a television? Yeah, I'm sure some of you might. But the point is, these things that were once rare luxuries of the rich are increasingly everybody expects it. I mean, every kid, once they get to like first grade or second grade, wants a cell phone now, right? I mean, or a computer, and it becomes increasingly necessities. Well, these same kind of technological, but also conveniences and comforts were being increasingly expected in early America as the economy grew, as society changed. And that was a growing perception between the wealthy and the poor. Just a brief summary of how early New England dealt with the truly poor, the really abject poor, the people that basically wouldn't survive without government assistance, was in early New England, in the early 1800s. Most towns used what was called the vendue system. It basically, they put out to auction the care of individual paupers. After the town meeting, the overseers of the poor would tell people they were going, okay, before you go home, guys, we're going to have an auction. And anybody who wanted to take a little bit of government money, town money, to take a poor person, usually an infirm elderly person, or a person with some kind of mental developmental issues, or severe disability, into their home and live in their house, they would accept bids on how little you would expect from the town to take a poor person in, and that was called the vendue. There's a lot of drawbacks to that, but it was seen as there's no infrastructure. You're just basically putting it out to bid, and the lowest bidder gets the pauper. But by the 1800s, increasing people were saying, well, that's not very humane, it's not very efficient, the families that take in the paupers are two spits away from poverty themselves, they're doing it, so they throw another potato in the pot and they get a little extra income so they don't become poor. And so a lot of towns, including Shrewsbury, specifically in 1827, decided to buy a house, buy some land, hire somebody with a patient wife, and set up an artificial town-run family that they called a poor farm. And so when anybody was destitute and enough to need government assistance, they were sent to this town-run farm, town-run home, for care. An artificial family was established, mostly of the elderly and infirm. I couldn't find a photograph of the early Shrewsbury poor farm. I've got the arrow pointing to where it is on the map, but I've got a picture of the Worcester poor farm right next door, to give you an idea. But anyway, again, the Charitable Society, and it was founded in this building, but they soon decided to start meeting in individuals' homes um, on the second Thursday of every month from 2 to 5, and they'd have an annual meeting once a year to elect officers. Um, and they met a lot of times at Elizabeth Denny Ward's house, and she lived near the center of town, and certainly had the means to host this gathering of women. Um, Another reason behind this idea that the women needed to get together to help care for the unfortunate in society was this growing feeling of gender spheres. Of there were certain parts of the society that were the domain of women, and certain parts of society were the domain of men. And basically, it's split down among where you look. The women were expected to look in towards family, towards home, towards raising children, educating children, preserving a good home environment. And men were told to go out in the cruel world of business and commerce and government and war and deal with those outside issues. And so, since poverty's at home, the women felt it was part of their sphere, of their role, to care for the unfortunate among them. So, like I said, they initially met here in the Central Hall, um, but this idea, as I said, was mirroring a lot of the Republican small r and representative institutions that were forming all over America. Now, since women were kind of barred from direct participation in politics, that being the outside sphere of the men, they still follow that idea of drafting the Constitution, electing officers, setting times, setting out articles, a very clear expression of their small r Republican political culture in the growing early republic. So at first, 44 women signed the Constitution in 1832. Eventually, a lot more signed. They ranged in age from Mrs. Ward, who was 72, she was the oldest, to Miss Augusta Miles, who was 14. About a third were girls and single women, ranging from 14 to 43. The mean age of the unmarried members was 23. The majority, about 62.5%, were married women who had their own houses, and they ranged in age from 22 to 72, with an average age of 43. In age, there were a reasonable cross-section of the town's women between 15 and 60, despite Mrs. Ward's leadership. Relatively few of the members were older women. They represented, the members of the Charitable Society represented only about 10% of the town's women and only 11% of the town's households. A few of the members were still girls in school. 7 were grandmothers. Most were married women living at home with children. There were 2 widows, and all but 2 of the 14 unmarried members later married. These are just slides to have something to look at besides me. Anyway, although Mrs. Ward played a major role in organizing society, she refused, despite much pleadings, sincere or otherwise, to take a formal position of leadership. In other words, when she got it running, she let other people be the officers. There was a directress, a second directress to run the meetings, and then 5 trustees who mostly had the responsibility of finding objects for the charity they were going to dispense. The most dominant member of the society was Elizabeth Ward's sister, Mary Miles, the wife of the former congregational minister from Grafton, who recently resigned and took up farming here in Shrewsbury. As a minister's wife with many years' experience, she certainly, knew how to assume a leadership role, and of course, being kin to the Ward family, the richest family in town, that certainly enhanced her prestige as a leader. Mrs. Eliza Allen, there's the Ward family. I don't have to tell you all about them, but excuse me. Eliza and her husband George Allen's house She was the wife of the current minister of the town and one of the 5 trustees who are running the organization. Less experienced and less well-connected than Mary Miles. She was still active but not a dominant figure in the group. There were 8 women elected to fill as first officers. As I said, Mary Miles, first directress. She chaired the meetings. There was a second directress who was basically a vice president who took over when the first directress wasn't there. And then a secretary treasurer who kept the records and handled the finances. That wasn't the case in the Shrewsbury Charitable Society, but I want to point out that in a lot of these female societies, they tried to make sure it was a single woman who's the treasurer, because the law at the time was followed the English practice of coverture, that basically a married woman was under the cover, under the dominance of her husband, and they were afraid that if a married woman was treasurer, if her husband got into debt, the treasury of the organization might be tapped to settle the husband's debts. So Shrewsbury Charitable Society didn't seem to follow that, but a lot of these always made sure that a single woman was the treasurer. But anyhow, let's see, where was I? Got off track by putting that little sideline in. So, and then 5 trustees to search out the objects of charity, and the trustees ranged in age from 21 to 57, averaging 37 years old. So there were, mostly married women of respectable age. One of them was, there's a more modern view of Eliza Allen, George Allen's house. Pardon me? I got this off the internet, so blame me if it's wrong. But anyway, and Chris helped me with a lot of images as well. Anyway, another one of the directresses was Lavinia Sumner, and she was daughter-in-law of the late and long-lived previous minister Joseph Sumner, who had served Shrewsbury from 1762 to 1824. Now that's a long pastorate, and lived next door to the meeting house and here to the central school. Another one was Harriet Snow. There's the Snow house. She was the young wife of the town clerk, who was also a selectman, a surveyor, an investor, and a landowner, Henry Snow. Of course, Elizabeth Ward and Mrs. Sarah Putnam, Elizabeth Ward's widowed daughter. There she is, Sarah Henshaw Ward Putnam. She was Elizabeth's widowed daughter. She'd been married all of 3 months. Her husband died, and then she never remarried. Lived as a widow the entire rest of her long life. But some people did that in the 19th century. I guess some people might do that today, but probably less. Anyway, and there was and then Mary Miles' niece, Mrs. Lydia Maynard, the wife of the Center Village gunsmith, Mrs. Sarah Fales, the wife of a well-to-do tanner in town, and Mrs. Elizabeth Allen, the first, not to be confused with the minister's wife, also served. But the Miles and Ward connection was clearly the most significant single influence in the society. So in a lot of words, the power went with kin as well as wealth. So, and there's another picture of Sarah Henshaw Ward Putnam later in life. And of course, Elizabeth's son, Thomas Ward Jr., and his wife, Harriet Plimpton Ward, and we've got pictures of them through the years. So watch them age. There we go. And there we go with her continuing to... A lot of pictures of her, You can certainly see it's the same woman. But anyhow, and the society's first meeting, of course, was held here, but then they rotated around the number of the members' house, especially those that lived here in the center of town. I've got arrows to some of the prominent leaders of the society and their houses here in town. But it wasn't, the hosting duties weren't evenly shared. 6 women hosted half the meetings. and those who hosted were almost always officers of the society, and many possessed more economic and domestic resources than some of their, as the word they use, sisters had. So if you had a bigger house, a richer husband, it was easier to host the charitable society meetings. Um, and so some women would host them a few times a year. Um, but sometimes a shoemaker's wife would host them, like Mrs. Susan Allen hosted a couple times. Um, anyway, let's see. The women in the society, their husbands were much more likely to be non-farmers, to be professional men, doctors, lawyers, ministers, artisans, blacksmiths, shoemakers, and merchants, storekeepers, than farmers in this society. So it tended to be the more, not that this is urban, but by 19th century standards, bordering on urban, certainly a clustered community. Um, and as a result, smaller farmers' wives and shoemakers' wives were dramatically underrepresented in society membership. So it tends to be the wives of the wealthier men with wider business connections that tend to be the members of the charitable society. Um, and also, they tend to be much more members of the congregational church than some of the other church societies in town. Um, in fact, one of the things that the charitable society did was gave money for for the pulpit and for books at the congregational meeting house. So they didn't have this idea of, oh, we have to be above it and not not donate to the congregational meeting house. Most of them belonged to that church and felt there was nothing wrong with giving to the church. Um, and again, most of them were kin. Jack, who wrote the paper, Jack, his original studies, he got a master's in history, but his undergraduate degree is in mathematics. He did a lot of calculating and numbers here, which I'm going to spare you if you don't mind, because that's not my forte. Um, I mean, I certainly could read the numbers if you care, but anyway, a lot of mothers got their daughters to join, especially as the years went by. Fewer daughters got their mothers to join, but a lot of mothers got their daughters to join. Um, so, and again, a lot of the women were related, but a little over half were not related to anyone else in the society. Um, you also had a lot of people in town, especially farmers, especially people that were newer to town, who were living in the more scattered countryside, and large family units, large neighborhoods of families interrelated, especially the Harringtons, the Smiths, and the Newtons, who were not members of the society, but they were oftentimes the objects of the charity of the society. Um, and they were often members of the Baptist church or the Universalist church in town. Um, and not as likely to join, and not the ones who joined the society, but were more recipients of the aid. Um, let's see. So they met every other Thursday except for bad weather. Um, even for church, it was really bad weather. People just didn't go. Um, and so one thing they did at every meeting was sewed. But that's what women tended to do anyway in the afternoon. Most women who were managing a household and devoted the morning of every day, except Sunday, was to cooking breakfast, cleaning up breakfast, doing some heavy chore, laundry one day, ironing another day, gardening, heavy cleaning of the house, um, and making dinner, the big meal of the day at midday. And then after cleaning up dinner, usually they would change their clothes and spend the afternoon sewing. Oftentimes going to a neighbor's house and sewing together for sociability. Sometimes, you pass a neighbor on the road. Oh, I was going to your house, Mildred. Oh, no, I was going to your house, Mary. Um, so sewing was what women tended to do for their afternoons, and they often tended to do it together. So the charitable society, in that sense, where they got around sewing, was no different. I don't know if you noticed that the scripture, the people sewing on the left, the leg standing up is Florence Nightingale. they're not New Englanders, they're Old Englanders, but still, there they are. Well, at least her sister sewing away. Anyhow, so rich and poor, women tended to spend, women and girls tended to spend a lot of their lives sewing. Um, and it became a regular routine to get together and be social, to sew together, because it was more fun than sewing alone, gathering around a window where you've got good light. Um, just a nice European painting of women sewing. Anyway, the point is that it was a common thing. What made the Charitable Society different is instead of darning your own husband's socks, instead of making a shirt for your own son, you're sewing for other people. The whole thing about the Charitable Society and why they needed it in a way that our society doesn't is because you could buy fabric at the store, but you couldn't buy pillowcases, you couldn't buy towels, you couldn't buy sheets, you couldn't buy a lot of common clothing. It was being made by hand by women in their households. And so what if you had a family in town where the woman was very sick, or the woman died, or the family had a fire? You couldn't just go to Walmart and buy new sheets and pillowcases and say, hey, here you go, have a nice life. It took a lot of female labor to make those domestic those domestic textiles and those garments. And so at the Charitable Society, they tend to be devoting their time sewing at the meeting, and sometimes their time sewing on their own time, to these charitable things. And the fabric they're donating as well to these charitable causes, to these individual families that they hear about in town that have suffered some kind of misfortune and need these things. So you end up with the women getting together for sociability and doing what they normally do, which is get together and sew. Making quilts, making individual garments, sometimes working communally on things, but they're also getting together for sociability. And oftentimes they tend to want to discuss serious subjects. And you go through the records of the Shrewsbury Charitable Society, and they're often talking about the idea to have their meetings talk about serious subjects, not engage in gossip and, oh, did you know what she did? Oh my gosh, oh, do you think she's... No, to say, look, let's keep it godly and serious, ladies. And they often have resolutions when you can assume that one meeting got a little out of hand with a little too much gossip and frivolity to do that. Now, sometimes they would form book clubs, which I know a lot of people still do today, and get together once a month and like this movie here, drink wine and talk about whatever book you read and talk about what's going on in your life. But they tend to read more serious books like The Path of Peace or The Practical Guide to Duty and Happiness by John Abbott, or Live and Let Live by Catherine Sedgwick. I mean, these are serious topics. They're basically under titles including Christian Homes, Worth and Wealth, The Perfection of God, The Christian Pilgrimage on Earth, The Genius of Reform, and so tend to be very moral books as well. And the non-moral selections are few and far between, and they're not like light novels or anything racy. It's like a lecture on China, or it was about as racy as they got. And so that, like I said, The Path of Peace was one. And John Stevens Abbott was often writing advice books telling women often how to live. The mother at home, the child at home, the schoolboy, the schoolgirl, basically, a minister telling everybody else how they should live their lives. And they're picking up serious topics to discuss as well. The providence of God, hope, what is truth. Trying to be very, very serious and dutiful in their topics for discussion while they're busy sewing. They did singing. They got together, but again, they tend to be singing hymns. They're not singing popular hits of the 1830s. They're singing hymns, religious topics. This is one song they sung: "Far from thy servants, God of grace, the unfeeling heart of remove, and form in our obedient souls the image of thy love. Oh, may our sympathizing breasts the generous knowledge know, kindly to share in others' joy and weep for others' woe." They even got to the point where they said, is it too much that we, the late afternoon, usually around 4 or 5 o'clock when the meeting's ending, it was common in families to have a light meal that didn't require cooking, cold food. That the meal was called tea. So they would usually serve tea and usually bread, butter, jam, maybe some cheese, maybe some cold meat, maybe some biscuits, that kind of thing. But they actually debated and voted whether or not to have tea. And for a while they said, no, it's too frivolous and too much of a burden on the hostess to have tea. So let's not have tea. But then they got back to tea and they thought it was a little too frivolous to have tea sometimes. But again, it was a sociability. Women getting together with people they knew, with friends, their family, and they're sewing, but they're sewing for others. So they vote on what they're going to donate or loan, because they didn't always give it as a gift outright. Sometimes they would loan people a set of towels or a set of sheets, expecting it back. If your family got back on your feet, they'd give out clothing to people, because these things weren't just things you could go and buy cheaply, from like Walmart. And so they would often sew garments for other people as well as their own families, because a lot of people did have incomplete family units, with the mother figure being either absent, dead by death or desertion or severe illness, and as well as selling household linen. So sometimes they got together and had a fair to raise money to give actual cash gifts to the poor who needed things. So they would spend their time sewing fancy things like fancy pincushions and fancy scarves and embroidered shawls and things that weren't just the necessities of life to give to the poor, but rather things to sell to raise money for the poor. And so they have a fair. We recreated one at Old Sturbridge Village, which is why you've got this modern woman looking at the stuff. So why is her shoulders bare? Well, that's because it's a 20th century person. But, and they sometimes make fancy cakes and things to sell as well, to raise money, floral arrangements, and other fancy goods they would sell to make money. And in 1838, there was a little poem composed by Elizabeth Denny Allen, about the Charitable Society fair that was held in 1838. And it goes on what I told you about who she was related to and blah, blah. And they published the poem that describes it. These people love bad poetry. You read newspapers of the day, there's all sorts of bad poetry in it. You read the books of the day, they're just all the bad poetry. Thrice welcome are ye all, kind friends, to meet us here today. You're called to see our fairy things this 24th of May. We welcome thee, for here thine eyes with pleasure shall behold a multitude of pretty things, all ready to be sold. Here is a bow for some fair lass, all dressed in sailor's clothes, blah, blah, blah. I'm not gonna, yeah. Here's dickies, ruffled bosoms too, for gentlemen to wear, and for the ladies turbans, nets, which will preserve the hair. Here's tulips, cherries, flowers to sell, with baskets, boxes fine, and racks to hold the ladies' cards, and useful in their line. Calling cards, not, playing cards. Come by, the object's truly good. The poor and needy claim a portion of thy liberal hand. Will thank thee for the same. It's more blessed, as we read, to give than to receive, and we shall feel the promise sure, if we this truth believe. Oh my gosh. Anyway, so like I said, another thing besides donating their time was they would usually donate the fabric. They'd also use the money they raised at the fair and through occasional cash donations to buy fabrics from country stores, including the storekeepers who were the husbands of some of the wives. In fact, for a while, they gave some of their surplus money, a couple of dollars, to the storekeeper husband of one of the members to invest for them. To, in other words, make the money work for them instead of just leaving it sitting in the treasury. But anyway, sewing for the poor was what they're doing. And sometimes they're not just sewing. Sometimes they're using the cash to buy a barrel of flour, to buy a loaf of sugar, to buy tea. That's what the brown leaves are. And other necessities, basics of life. They bought one poor woman a little stove for her comfort. That's not her. That was just a picture of a 19th century woman sitting by a stove that I found. Anyway, but mostly they're sewing children's clothes, women's clothes, household linen, sometimes men's shirts and other garments. But like I said, they're just donating their time. I threw this in because I thought it was a cool slide of 4 of Elizabeth Ward's children in old age, which is kind of cool, I thought. Anyway, so the Charitable Society, they did a lot of serious work. They tried to make it enjoyable for each other, but they really did take it all quite seriously, and take their time for what they were doing and try to serve who they saw as the deserving poor among them. In other words, people that through misfortune needed help, not people that through laziness or sloth couldn't make a living. And so a lot of times it was unmarried women who were usually not from Shrewsbury originally, but had just found themselves here that ended up. And the other thing to keep in mind is while the trustees are finding the people that need poor, the poor don't go to the society. They don't show up at the meeting and say, "Hey, help me." It's the trustees of the society that, through whatever local grapevine, find out about people that they think could use their help, and they vote as a group to decide who they're going to donate to, whether it's fabric, whether it's fancy goods, and how they spend the money that's either donated to them or raised by their fairs. And so anyway, I'm just gonna the conclusion is that they met in domestic settings. Occasionally they met upstairs instead of in their own houses. But they performed traditional tasks, but organized themselves in what was an untraditional way for women. They confined themselves to women's concerns, sewing, helping the sick, clothing children, but used them in part at least as a vehicle for group self-assertion, for making their presence felt in the world. These women read, wrote, spoke, and probably thought in a language that today we would find turgid and cloying, like that poem, but it was a language that we need to decode rather than just reject, because it was used to articulate their newly self-conscious way that their basic assumptions about their community and their lives were changing. The charitable transaction itself was a newly self-conscious and rationalized form of what some women had done individually and informally for all time in their own neighborhoods. Again, this is that voluntary association that was so unique to American life across both genders in the early 19th century. The society's economic life, with its mixture of cash and barter exchange between households, mass production for distant markets, and direct production for immediate use. Occasionally, they'd give store credit to the needy, as well as surplus cash. It's a remarkable mirror of how American New England society was changing itself in the early 19th century. Running through these themes of change, we also have gained a sense built up through looking at the details of meetings and encounters, the occupation of households, the life crisis, and the language of feeling how the community was being experienced in daily life. Shrewsbury in the 1830s was a community in transition, with a new structure of small-scale institutions still in a rural setting, emerging out of a much more homogeneous and less complexly organized agrarian past. It was also a particular landscape of fields and fences, shops, mills, houses, lived in by people no less real than we are. In thinking about the past, we can ask, what did it mean? What was it like? But for a small corner of a small place in the past that we're in right now, this paper was an attempt to try to answer some of those questions of what life was like 200 years ago. Again, if you want to learn more, these are some good ideas. Thank you. Again, this is the late Jack Larkin's work, not mine. So.